August 22, 1944. A supply depot sat 12 miles south of the Normandy beaches, where diesel fuel hung thick in the air, mixing with salt spray that drifted up from the English Channel. In his headquarters near Paris, German Oberstleutnant Klaus Brenner reviewed intelligence reports with the precision of a man who trusted numbers far more than propaganda. His conclusion was grim. American logistics would collapse within 10 days. Their Negro labor units, he believed, lacked the discipline and education for operations on this scale. Across occupied France, in officers' clubs where generals gathered, glasses were raised to what seemed like America's fatal weakness, an army that handed trucks to men they considered incapable of reading maps. 200 miles to the east, General Patton's Third Army was hemorrhaging fuel. 32,000 gallons remained. 48 hours stood between them and immobility, at which point 400-ton tanks would become expensive roadblocks. Normal supply lines through rail depots would need 8 to 10 days to catch up. The lightning advance that might end the war by Christmas was about to starve. Then Captain Robert Whitmore proposed the impossible, a dedicated truck convoy running around the clock every single day. 132 trucks per convoy, 400-mile round trips, 5,000 tons daily, no stops except at checkpoints. He called it the Red Ball Express. Corporal Jimmy Birdsong, a mechanic from Tuskegee, who could diagnose a failing engine bearing by listening to it, volunteered immediately. Around him, dozens of black soldiers raised their hands. They knew what every white major and German general expected: failure within a week. That assessment sat on desks throughout the Wehrmacht. Proof they believed that America's greatest weakness wasn't firepower or tactics, it was trust. They'd placed their most critical supply operation of the entire Western campaign into the hands of men they didn't believe could handle it. By September 4th, those same generals would be reading very different numbers. 12,500 tons delivered in a single day. The impossible had become reality. Jimmy Birdsong's hands moved with precision born from years of muscle memory. He pressed into the mud beside the GMC truck's right rear wheel, guiding the torque wrench through its final quarter turn, feeling that satisfying click that meant the lug nut had seated perfectly, not stripped, not loose, but secured to the hub the way it needed to be for 500 miles of French road ahead. The pre-dawn darkness smelled of diesel and salt spray from the Channel. 12 miles to the north. The invasion beaches were already 2 months behind them now, yet close enough that you could taste ocean in every breath. He'd been awake all night, moving between trucks in the motor pool, checking tire pressure and oil levels and brake lines, with the methodical attention other men reserved for prayer. In his breast pocket, folded into a small square against his heart, was his brother David's last letter, dated June 4th, delivered June 9th. 2 days after David died outside Carentan, doing something characteristically reckless, pulling a wounded white soldier back to cover while German machine guns tore the earth apart around them both. Jimmy had read that letter so many times he could recite it in his sleep. David's voice remained loud and optimistic in his mind, even now. "Just keep the engine running, Jimmy. Keep moving forward. That's all any of us can do." The crunch of boots on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. Captain Robert Whitmore emerged from the operations tent, rolled maps tucked under one arm, his expression suggesting he'd slept even less than Jimmy had. Whitmore was West Point, son of a railroad superintendent, different from most white officers in ways that mattered. He looked at you when he spoke, not through you. He asked mechanics their opinions on maintenance schedules like their answers actually counted for something. "Birdsong," Whitmore said, kneeling beside him in the mud without hesitation. He spread one of the maps across the truck's running board. "I need you to see this before the briefing." The map showed a line stretching from their position near Saint-Lô, eastward past Chartres. 200 miles of French countryside where Patton's Third Army raced forward at 30 miles daily, punching holes in German defenses faster than anyone thought possible. But there was a problem. And Whitmore's finger traced it with the grim certainty of a man who understood that wars were won with fuel and bullets, not just courage. "4th Armored Division is here," Whitmore said, tapping a spot impossibly far away. "They're down to 32,000 gallons. At their burn rate, they've got 48 hours, before every tank becomes an expensive roadblock. Normal supply lines, rail, depot distribution, the whole system we built, will take 8 to 10 days to catch up. Jimmy studied the map, then looked at Whitmore. His understanding bloomed like cold water in his chest. Patton's gonna run dry. Patton's gonna run dry, Whitmore confirmed, and when he does, the whole advance stalls. Maybe the whole damn war. He pulled out a second map, this one hand-drawn with routes and numbers in Whitmore's precise engineer's script. Unless we do something nobody's tried before. A dedicated truck convoy, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. One-way loop from here to the front and back. 132 trucks per convoy, 5-ton payloads, 400-mile round trips. If we can deliver 5,000 tons daily, Patton keeps rolling. Jimmy studied the numbers, his mechanic's brain already calculating maintenance intervals and failure rates. It was audacious. It was probably impossible. It was exactly the kind of thing David would have volunteered for first and asked questions later. "I'm in," Jimmy said. Whitmore nodded like he'd expected nothing less. But before he could respond, voices drifted from the operations tent, loud enough that both men heard every word. A white infantry major, voice thick with bourbon and contempt. Colored boys driving trucks. Patton's gonna run dry before they figure out a map. Laughter followed, the kind that made Jimmy's jaw clench. Then Whitmore's executive officer emerged, carrying a captured German intelligence document. He read the translation aloud. American logistical collapse within 10 days. Their Negro labor units lack the discipline and education for sustained operations of this scale. The report was dated August 20th, 2 days ago. Signed by some German logistics officer named Brenner, who'd probably never met a black soldier in his life, but was certain he knew their capabilities. Jimmy's hand found the letter in his breast pocket, pressing it flat against his chest. Around him, other drivers were gathering, men who'd heard the same dismissal in a dozen different forms from 100 different voices their entire lives. The job had just shifted from difficult to personal. This wasn't about fuel anymore. This wasn't even about Patton. This was about proving every doubter, every racist, every enemy general dead wrong. This was about numbers they couldn't dismiss and tonnage they couldn't ignore. This was about David's last words: keep the engine running, keep moving forward. Whitmore stood, raising his voice so every driver could hear. First convoy rolls at 0600 hours, August 25th. You're the express now. No stops except checkpoints. No excuses. He held up a bucket of red paint and a brush. Everyone gets one of these. He painted a red circle on Jimmy's truck bumper. Bright, unmistakable, a target and a promise. Welcome to the Red Ball Express, Whitmore said. Let's show them what we can do. The road became a river of olive drab and diesel exhaust within the first hour. Route Nationale 13 stretched eastward like a promise Jimmy wasn't sure they could keep. Many feet wide, one lane in each direction, convoys passing every 90 seconds in a choreographed dance that left no margin for error. Jimmy drove truck 47, hand steady on the wheel, eyes scanning ahead for shell craters and abandoned equipment, while his partner slouched in the passenger seat, fighting to stay awake. Private Hector Ruiz was 19. Mexican-American from a ranch outside San Antonio, constitutionally incapable of silence for more than 5 minutes. My girl Rosa, he said, for the third time that hour. She writes me every week. Says when I get home, her papa's gonna teach me the ranch business. Says there's good money in cattle if you know what you're doing. He paused, then grinned. You think driving trucks counts as knowing what I'm doing? Ask me in 200 miles, Jimmy said, but he was smiling despite himself. Hector had that effect, relentless optimism that wore down your defenses until you either wanted to strangle him or adopt him as a younger brother. Jimmy had chosen the latter somewhere around hour 3 of their first convoy. They rotated every 4 hours, one driving while the other navigated or tried to sleep on the bench seat. Though sleep was theoretical at best when the truck bucked over roads that had been bombed, patched and bombed again. The 2.5-ton carried 5 tons of fuel in jerry cans, stacked and strapped in the cargo bed with enough redundancy that even a blowout wouldn't turn them into a fireball. The engine was governed at 45 miles per hour maximum, but loaded they averaged 25, and empty they could push 35 if the road cooperated. Jimmy trusted the brakes. The math was brutal and beautiful. 6 miles per gallon loaded, 60 yards spacing between trucks, 9 to 11 hours each way, depending on traffic and weather and how many breakdowns happened ahead. In the first week, they delivered 4,800 tons daily. Not the 5,000 Whitmore wanted, but close enough that headquarters stopped sending worried telegrams and started sending congratulations. The breakdowns were the killer. 15 to 20 trucks per day went down. Blown tires, overheated engines, burned-out clutches. Jimmy saw the pattern before anyone else. A carburetor flooding problem, hitting multiple trucks in the same temperature ranges, fuel-air mixture going too rich, and choking engines until they coughed themselves dead. He spent one night at a staging area, taking apart 3 carburetors side by side, finding needle valve seats worn just enough to let excess fuel through. He developed a field adjustment involving a specific wrench angle and knowing when to stop before you strip the threads. He taught the fix to every mechanic who'd listen, then to drivers who carried tools, then to Whitmore, who put it in a technical bulletin that went army-wide 3 weeks later. Breakdowns dropped by 30%. Whitmore established dedicated breakdown teams with spare parts caches every 50 miles. Portable garages could swap a tire in 12 minutes or a fuel pump in 40. The French civilians surprised Jimmy most. They lined the roads in small towns, leaving water and food at makeshift stands, waving American flags sewn from bedsheets and stolen parachute silk. Children ran alongside the trucks shouting, "Merci," until their mothers pulled them back to safety. An old woman in Alençon pressed a bottle of wine into Hector's hands at a checkpoint, kissing both his cheeks and speaking rapid French that neither of them understood. But gratitude needed no translation. At a fuel dump near Chartres, they met a tanker, a white kid from Ohio, maybe 22, grease stains on his coveralls and exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He walked straight to Jimmy's truck, stuck out his hand, and waited until Jimmy took it. "You guys are the reason we're still moving," the tanker said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Jimmy felt something crack open in his chest, something frozen solid since June 7th, when the telegram arrived about David. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and the tanker saluted, not regulation, but heartfelt, before heading back to his Sherman. That night, parked at a staging area with engines cooling and stars bright overhead, Hector asked Jimmy about the letter he kept touching in his breast pocket. So Jimmy told him about David, about Omaha Beach, about the silver star that arrived the same day as the body, about the last words, "Keep the engine running, keep moving forward." "We're doing that," Hector said quietly. "Every mile, every ton, we're keeping it running." Jimmy looked at his young partner, this kid who talked too much about his girl and his dreams and his faith that the world would be different after the war. Maybe Hector was right. Maybe every mile was a promise kept. Maybe every ton delivered was proof that David's optimism wasn't misplaced. "Yeah," Jimmy said finally. "I guess we are." The system hit its stride the first week of September, like an engine finally finding its ideal temperature. More innovations kept compounding. Cab swapping at midpoint checkpoints where fresh drivers took over trucks without full rest stops, cut turnaround time by 3 hours per convoy. Priority radio nets for breakdown calls meant repair teams could intercept disabled trucks before they became roadblocks. Portable fuel pumps at forward dumps unloaded trucks in 8 minutes instead of 20. Suddenly, the math that had seemed impossible in August was merely difficult. September 4th changed everything. Jimmy was on his second run of the day, eyes gritty with exhaustion but hand steady on the wheel, when he passed a checkpoint where Whitmore stood with a clipboard and an expression that looked like a man who'd just witnessed something he didn't quite believe. The captain flagged him down, practically shouting over the engine noise. 12,500 tons, Whitmore said, his voice cracking slightly on the numbers. "In 24 hours, we just broke every logistics record in theater." Jimmy felt the weight of that number settle into his bones. 12,500 tons. Every jerry can, every ammunition crate, every ration box, proof written in diesel fuel and worn brake pads that they could do what the German generals said was impossible. Proof that Major Kensington's dismissal was ignorance, not insight. Proof that Brenner's intelligence assessment was prejudice masquerading as analysis. The news rippled through the convoy network like electricity through copper wire. At rest stops, drivers who'd been running on fumes and determination suddenly stood straighter, smiled wider, slapped each other's backs with joy that came from vindication. Patton's Third Army was liberating towns faster than mapmakers could update their charts. Tanks hit 50 miles per hour on open roads. The blitzkrieg that almost died in August was rolling toward Germany with unstoppable momentum. Stars and Stripes ran a photograph 3 days later, Jimmy changing a tire on Truck 47, torque wrench in hand, concentration carved into his face. The caption read, "The men keeping Patton rolling." Someone mailed a copy to his mother in Tuskegee. She sent it back with a note in her careful handwriting. "David would be so proud. I am too." Whitmore received a commendation from Eisenhower's headquarters, a single-page letter praising innovative solutions to complex logistical challenges under combat conditions. The captain pinned it to the operations tent wall, then went back to calculating tonnage per hour and driver rotation efficiency, as if the recognition was just another data point in his endless spreadsheet of the possible. The strangest moment came at a rest stop outside Rams, where white and black soldiers shared coffee for the first time without the invisible but absolute segregation that governed every other interaction. An older sergeant with a thick Georgia accent, probably 52, sat down across from Jimmy with 2 tin cups and slid one across the makeshift table. That sergeant, Holloway, carried the weight of a man who'd built something from nothing. His trucking company ran 300 vehicles across the southern states, roots deep in that red clay soil. His father had created an empire out of diesel and determination, and now he sat across from Jimmy with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little until recently. "I grew up thinking I knew everything about moving freight," Holloway said, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. His gaze drifted somewhere beyond the tent walls, beyond this war entirely. "You boys are doing something I didn't believe was possible." Jimmy waited, feeling the weight of David's letter against his chest. He'd taken to keeping it there, over his heart, close enough to feel its presence through fabric and uniform. "Hell, I didn't think it was possible either," Holloway continued. "I've been wrong about a lot of things." The older man's eyes found Jimmy's then, direct and unflinching. "Took me 52 years and a war to figure that out. But I know engines and I know driving." He leaned forward slightly. "And what you did with that carburetor fix, that was brilliance. Real brilliance." Holloway stood to leave, then paused. He turned back, his voice dropping lower. "Your brother, the one you carry that letter for, he'd be proud. That night marked a turning point." For the first time since June 7th, since the beach and the hedgerows and the sound of David's voice calling from somewhere unreachable, Jimmy slept without nightmares. There were no dreams of machine gun fire tearing through hedges, no visions of his brother's face hovering just beyond reach. Just the simple mercy of darkness and rest, and far away, the rumble of engines keeping faith with a promise made weeks earlier. 200 miles to the east, in a commandeered chateau that served as logistics headquarters, Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner spread fresh delivery reports across his desk. The numbers wouldn't leave him alone. He recalculated the projections, hoping the mathematics might shift if he approached them differently. They didn't. American tonnage climbed steadily. If they maintained 5,000 tons daily, and the latest intelligence suggested they were already exceeding that figure, Army Group B would be forced to retreat to the West Wall by October. He drafted a memo marked urgent, stating clearly that American logistical capacity had been underestimated and recommending immediate strategic reassessment. 3 hours later, his superior returned it with a single sentence scrawled across the top. "The Negro units will break. Hold position." Brenner filed the memo in his personal journal. He dated it September 5, 1944, and wrote beneath it in precise, careful script, "They will not break." We will. The numbers never lied, even when a man desperately wished them to. Outside his window, German supply trucks carried 800 tons per day along roads that had once sustained 3,000. The mathematics of collapse were written plainly for anyone willing to read them. But the Army, Brenner had learned, preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. He wondered sometimes if those American drivers understood they were winning a war. most people didn't even recognize was being fought. The collapse accelerated with autumn rain and German desperation in mid-September. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at the supply lines, fighting with the fury of men who understood they were losing. Jimmy was running his morning route when the engines screamed overhead. Focke-Wulf 190s dropping out of low clouds with 20mm cannons blazing. The convoy line erupted in chaos. Tracers stitched white-hot lines across grey sky. Jimmy swerved hard right, felt his truck's rear wheels slide through mud, fought the steering wheel with both hands to keep from tipping. The earth seemed to suck at his tires, trying to pull him down into it. 3 trucks weren't as fortunate. They burned where they stopped. Black smoke climbing into the clouds. When the shooting finished and Jimmy could breathe again, he counted 11 drivers dead, 28 wounded, men he'd shared coffee with that morning. Men who'd believed the promise that if they just kept moving forward, kept the engine running, everything would work out. The weather turned vicious. Autumn rains came early and heavy, transforming roads into rivers of thick mud that grabbed at tires and dragged them down. Speeds that had averaged 25 miles per hour in August now crawled at 15. Convoys that once completed a full loop in 20 hours now required 30. Trucks sank to their axles at checkpoints, requiring winches and 30 minutes of cursing to extract them. The careful mathematics Whitmore had built, tonnage per hour, fuel consumption rates, delivery schedules, crumbled like wet paper. Mechanical failures spiked beyond anything Jimmy had ever witnessed. 65% of trucks needed major repairs. Clutches burned out from constant low gear grinding through mud. Transmissions cracked under the strain, brake lines corroded. The spare parts inventory that had seemed abundant in August was exhausted by September 10th. Fuel consumption doubled because engines were laboring twice as hard just to move, which meant they were burning the fuel they were supposed to deliver just to make the delivery. Daily tonnage plummeted to 3,200 tons, barely enough to keep the line functioning, nowhere near enough to maintain any offensive momentum. Jimmy worked 20-hour shifts trying to keep trucks operational. He taught drivers clutch-saving techniques and jury-rigged repairs with whatever materials he could scavenge. But there weren't enough hours or hands or spare parts to stop the hemorrhaging. The worst moment came on September 11th. Hector was driving solo because Jimmy's shift had already run 18 hours straight, and Whitmore had ordered him to rest. But Hector's truck hit a shell crater hidden beneath standing water. The 2.5-ton vehicle overturned, 5 tons of ammunition spilling across the road like a child's toys scattered. By the time Jimmy arrived, Hector was conscious but screaming. His left leg bent at an angle that made Jimmy's stomach turn over. "I'm sorry," Hector kept saying through tears that carved tracks through the mud on his face. "I'm sorry, Jimmy. I let you down. I should have seen it. Should have been more careful." Jimmy gripped his partner's hand while medics worked the fracture into a splint. "You didn't let anyone down. You hear me? You did everything right. This isn't on you." But watching the ambulance disappear down the road, Jimmy felt the weight of every promise settling on his shoulders like wet concrete. Keep the engine running, keep moving forward, except the engines were failing and forward had become a fantasy. And his partner was heading to a field hospital with a compound fracture that might end his war. The ultimatum arrived that afternoon. Whitmore called Jimmy into the operations tent, where the captain sat surrounded by maps that no longer matched reality and delivery reports that read like casualty lists. His eyes were rimmed red from exhaustion and something that looked like defeat. "Headquarters gave us 72 hours, Whitmore said quietly. "Restore 8,000 tons per day, or they shut us down. Divert resources to rail repair." The message was clear. They were expendable. Jimmy stood there holding David's letter, which he'd pulled from his pocket without thinking. Around him, through the tent flaps, he could see dozens of broken trucks, exhausted drivers, mud stretching everywhere. The motor pool looked like a graveyard for mechanical dreams. A white officer walked past outside, his voice carrying clearly through the canvas. "Told you they couldn't handle it." Jimmy crumpled David's letter in his fist before he realized what he was doing. The paper, read so many times it had grown soft as fabric, wrinkled in his grip. Then he smoothed it out again, carefully, methodically, the way he'd smoothed technical diagrams before studying the solution hidden in the lines. "We've got 72 hours, he said. Whitmore looked up, surprise flickering across the exhaustion on his face. 72 hours is enough time to figure this out, Jimmy continued. We didn't come this far to quit because of mud and bad luck. The captain studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. What do you need? Sleep, 4 hours. Then I need to talk to every driver and every mechanic in this motor pool. He looked at David's letter one more time, reading the last line in his brother's optimistic scrawl. We're not done yet, not even close. Jimmy didn't sleep the full 4 hours. His mind started working the problem like an engine diagnosis the moment he closed his eyes. Symptoms, patterns, root causes. The failures weren't random. There was a signature to them, a rhythm he'd been too exhausted to see until desperation forced him to look deeper. He walked the motor pool in pre-dawn darkness, talking to every driver still awake, every mechanic cursing over disassembled transmissions. He asked the same questions over and over. What failed first? What were you doing when it happened? What did it sound like? The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in a chemical bath. Every catastrophic failure traced back to the same source, clutches burning out from constant mud driving, slipping, and overheating until the friction material glazed over and stopped gripping properly. But there was a workaround, something his daddy had taught him years ago on Tuskegee tractors when Jimmy was 14, and learning that machines responded to respect, not force. Double clutching, rev matching on every shift. Cracking RPMs low in first gear so the clutch engaged smoothly instead of grabbing and slipping. It was technique, not parts. And technique could be taught faster than replacement clutches could be requisitioned. He spent the night teaching 40 drivers, demonstrating on truck 47 until his left leg cramped from working the clutch pedal through 100 practice shifts. Some drivers picked it up immediately. They had the feel for it, the mechanical sympathy that separated good operators from great ones. Others needed repetition and patience. Jimmy's calm voice guided them through the rev range until muscle memory took over and thought became pure instinct. By dawn on September 13th, every convoy rolling out had drivers using the new technique. By noon, word had spread through the entire Red Bull network like fire through dry grass. Meanwhile, Whitmore was fighting his own battle. He bypassed official channels completely, calling in a favor from an old quartermaster who'd worked railroads before the war and understood that sometimes regulations were obstacles rather than solutions. Together, they borrowed 200 replacement clutches earmarked for rear echelon vehicles, staff cars and courier trucks that would limp along on worn friction plates. Whitmore falsified the paperwork, signing requisition forms with serial numbers that didn't match reality. If this failed, he'd face court-martial for misappropriation of military resources. If we're going down, he told Jimmy, we're going down swinging. The turnaround came faster than either man dared hope. On September 14th, deliveries climbed to 6,800 tons as roads began drying, and the clutch technique cut mechanical failures in half. September 15th brought 9,200 tons, just shy of the August peak, but more than headquarters demanded. Trucks that should have been deadline were still running. Drivers who'd learned double clutching were teaching others. The mathematics of collapse reversed into the mathematics of resurrection. September 16th delivered 11,100 tons. Not quite the record, but close enough. When Whitmore received the headquarters telegram confirming Red Bull would continue operations, he sat down hard in his camp chair and didn't speak for 5 minutes. 200 miles east, Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner sat in his requisitioned chateau, examining a captured American operations log from a destroyed convoy. Some lieutenant had kept meticulous records, maintenance schedules, driver rotation patterns, tonnage tallies, even technical notes about clutch-saving techniques and field repairs. Brenner read it 3 times, cross-referencing against his own supply reports, and felt something close to awe settle into his chest. The precision was breathtaking. The adaptability was extraordinary. These weren't labor units failing under pressure. These were professionals executing complex operations with more consistency than his own forces had achieved in months. He opened his personal journal, dated the entry September 17, 1944, and wrote in the small, precise script that characterized everything he did. We underestimated not their courage, that was never in question, but their capacity for adaptation and their industrial will. The American Negro drivers have delivered more tonnage in 3 weeks than our entire Army group received in 2 months. This is not a failure of our intelligence. It is a failure of our prejudice. We dismiss them because of who they were, not what they could do. History will remember this as one of many reasons we lost. He closed the journal and filed the captured log in his personal archives. He updated his strategic assessment to reflect reality. Army Group fuel deliveries had dropped to 600 tons daily. American deliveries exceeded 10,000. The war was over, not today, not this month, but inevitably, mathematically, undeniably over. The numbers always told the truth that pride refused to acknowledge. Back in France, Jimmy stood at a memorial service for the 21 Red Bull drivers killed in action. The names were read slowly, respectfully. Each one represented a life that had believed the promise was worth keeping. When the chaplain asked if anyone wanted to speak, Jimmy found himself walking forward before conscious thought caught up with decision. He pulled David's letter from his breast pocket, creased and worn and precious, and read it aloud for the first time since June. His voice shook on some words, steadied on others, but he made it through to the end. Jimmy, if something happens to me, just keep the engine running. That's all any of us can do. Keep moving forward. We kept it running, Jimmy said to the assembled drivers, to the memory of his brother, to himself. 412,000 tons between August and November, 12,500 per day. The generals who laughed aren't laughing anymore. Sergeant Holloway found him afterward. The old Georgian, with 30 years of trucking and all that prejudice that had come with it, seemed to be slowly crumbling under the weight of witnessed excellence. He saluted, not regulation, but earned, and his voice was rough when he spoke. Your brother would be proud, son. Jimmy nodded, unable to speak, and carefully folded David's letter back into his pocket. The road ahead was clear. The fuel would reach the front. The numbers didn't lie, and neither did the proof written in diesel and determination across 200 miles of French road. They had delivered the impossible, and history would remember the math made certain of it.